I wanted to just do a couple of things in a preliminary way before we really get started. The first is to thank Jeff Pierce, who is now our Director of Logistics. Is that? Logistics Operations. Sounds like 007, Jeff. Yeah, here at the college. And he's been deeply involved in the Humanities Center since we started in terms of enthusiastic support and providing us with some wonderful speakers. And so he helped to organize the event today. And before I hand this over to Jeff so that he can introduce our speaker, Mr. Wolfe, I wanted to just say to my students from English 253 that if you would please take notes and then give them to me tomorrow in class. It might be hard because I have to dash out of here at the end of our class period, which is 12:10, in order to get up over to my next class. And I know some of you may have to leave too. So take good notes, hand them in tomorrow for points, and then that way we'll have some memory when we finally do get to modernism. So I'll be happy to introduce Jeff Pierce.
Thank you, Joyce. Good morning. Thank you for coming. A few housekeeping notes. Please turn off any phones or handheld devices that might disrupt the presentation this morning. Also, if you need to sneak out early today, please do so as quietly as possible. I'd like to thank Dr. Joyce Walker, the Everett Community College Humanities Center, and the Everett Community College Foundation for cooperating to bring Gregory Wolfe to our campus today to speak on the topic of Modernism Undone, TS Eliot's literary revolution. Mr. Wolfe is writer-in-residence and director of the MFA in Creative Writing program at Seattle Pacific University. He's also the founder and editor of Image, one of America's leading literary quarterlies, and the author and co-author of several books, including Books That Build Character, A Guide to Teaching Your Child Moral Values Through Stories, and most recently, Beauty Will Save the World, Recovering the Human in an Ideological Age. Mr. Wolfe and his wife, the novelist Suzanne M. Wolfe, are the parents of 4 children. Please help me give Gregory Wolfe a warm welcome to Everett Community College.
Second while I get my technology organized. An iPad, a cell phone, and an on button. Am I on? Can you hear me? Woo, all right. Well, thank you. I am very grateful to Jeffrey for the invitation. And I do feel a little stressed out though, because I have a feeling with that open door, the open doors at either end, and spring finally seemingly having sprung, I'm just going to see eyes kind of moving to these patches of sunlight outside these doors. That's okay. That's all right. Go enjoy it. I'll do my best to distract you from spring for at least another hour or so. Excuse me. Well, I'm here to talk about revolution, which I know is the theme for your Humanities Center for the year. I'm going to focus on a single writer named TS Eliot, who was born in the 1880s and died in the early 1960s. T.S. Eliot is somebody who, at least in my youth, was such a towering figure that you couldn't avoid him even if you tried. I'm just curious, how many of you have ever studied T.S. Eliot in school of any kind? Just raise your hand. All right, so it looks to me like about a third of the audience. Now, if you'd asked me if I was in an audience when I was in college, 150 years ago, I would have, the entire class would have raised their hands, because Eliot was such a towering figure at that time. He'd only died, a couple decades before, and he was the kind of writer who had a huge sort of moral and cultural authority for his time. It's difficult almost to really think of anybody right now that we would look at in our current day to have that kind of sort of massive influence and sort of moral / cultural / literary authority of T.S. Eliot. In fact, we're not an age that really looks to authorities that much. We like to subvert authority. We tend to be cynical and jaded about whether there are such people. And interestingly enough, Eliot has suffered a sort of huge decline in reputation in the literary and intellectual worlds. And that's probably one reason why Eliot's not taught that often these days. A number of reasons for this, including our skepticism about figures who have that kind of almost prophetic quality. Eliot was somebody who embraced certain political and philosophical views that our time has also been very deeply suspicious about. It's also been pointed out, for example, Eliot once called himself, he rarely issued manifestos, but the one time he came very close to uttering a manifesto, it was almost absurd in the context of the time because his manifesto was so seemingly out of date and a throwback to another time. He said, in aesthetics, I am a classicist. This was at a time when Romanticism was still very much beloved by everybody, and classicism seemed like dry, hyper-structured, ordered stuff, Doric and Ionic columns, this sort of neoclassicism that, was fine in the 18th century, but we were beyond that kind of very rational, intellectual kind of approach. We were emotional, we were about the depth of the psyche and, the emotions, and Freud and all these things were opening up for us these rich ideas. So to call yourself a classicist was really, pretty much like Three Stooges poking the world of the intellectual world of the modern West in the eyeballs. And then he said, in religion, I am an Anglo-Catholic, which is this sort of high church wing of Episcopal or Anglican communion. And that's weird on several levels, including that he still even believed in any religion at that point, because this is modernity. He's making this statement in the 20s or 30s, I forget exactly when. And, Christianity wasn't exactly sort of winning a lot of hearts and minds at the Times Literary Supplement and the New York Review of Books at that time. And then he said, and in politics, I am a monarchist. Like, what? Huh? Now, this is an American writer. He was born in St. Louis, but he became an expatriate writer in London. And you can't get more conservative as an American, even as an American living in England, which has a queen, than to call yourself a monarchist. So Eliot, in some ways, in our progressive, liberal, secular era, has seemingly been left behind and discredited as an important figure. For a number of reasons, I think that's unfortunate. I think we should strive in the way we often talk about being inclusive and multicultural and pluralistic in our contemporary environment. We should make sure that we're not eliminating great writers and thinkers who have something to say for us and keeping them as part of the total package of the literary and cultural inheritance that we need to learn from in order to face the issues of our own day. But he was a revolutionary in his own time. He was definitely pretty hip, and his revolution, the revolution that he began with, was something called modernism. Now, what I want to suggest today, in the time that I have, is that as a revolutionary, TS Eliot began in the heat of an exciting new movement, a sort of brand new creative explosion in the early 20th century. That he came to be one of its greatest exemplars and live in the same literary pantheon as such other great writers as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. But that in a strange way, he came to see the very flaws of the very revolutionary movement that he had belonged to, and that in his own writing, he points the way toward postmodernism. So he's a revolutionary who, in some ways, went against his own revolution in the long run. But what I want to suggest, what I want to mess around with your minds a little bit is,
sometimes a revolution is not a permanent elimination of what it seems to be negating, but a new synthesis. It's looking for a way of getting away from the immediate past and breaking away from the immediate past, which has become boring and stultifying and expected, and trying to nonetheless ultimately unify itself with a larger tradition. That revolutionaries are often people who care about the tradition, but they believe that what has in the most immediate past has become dead, lifeless. And I think that's what Eliot's story tells us in many ways. Now, there are people, of course, who look at Eliot's career and say, guy was a traitor. He turned his back on us. And of course, that's something that we're free to think. Eliot was somebody who definitely was a controversial figure then as well as now. Others in the past have been similar, though, and we should be cautious before we condemn. For example, I don't know if any of you are in love with romantic poetry, but if you are and you've read anything about, say, William Wordsworth, Wordsworth was very much considered a revolutionary at the beginning of the 19th century. He was the avatar with Coleridge of romantic poetry, which was a response to classicism, remember. And he was a man of the people. He wanted to write poetry, as he said in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, in the language really spoken by men. He wanted to get away from artificial diction, the way that artists can create this little enclosed world, and he wanted to get real. He wanted to become a democratic poet. And in many ways, somebody like Walt Whitman in the US would become very much a similar figure. Let's get away from the way art becomes this little system, this little enclosed world. Let's talk about real life in the words that real people used. And when Wordsworth started, he was a champion of the French Revolution. And when he wrote his first great poem, The Prelude, his great epic long poem about his life, he said about the French Revolution, bliss it was to be alive in a very heaven, to be alive at the time when the French Revolution sought to emphasize the rights of man and democracy and the common man against that old aristocratic order that was oppressive and artificial and not real relationships, but a structure imposed on reality. So you can see there's both a political and a literary thing going on. A desire for naturalness and freedom against the artificial and the imposed. And so Wordsworth went along. Unfortunately, what happened with the French Revolution is that they started chopping a lot of people's heads off. And more people's heads. And then you got into what was called the kind of terror of the French Revolution. And Wordsworth began to change his opinion about it. And he, in later years, turned and praised Edmund Burke, the great member of Parliament and great writer and oratorical figure of the 18th century, who was a critic, a conservative critic of the French Revolution. And then people looked at Wordsworth and they said, traitor, you've gone soft. You've gone conservative in your old age. But it's interesting that revolution is often about youth. Revolution is about the young. They often talk about the need to kind of slay the fathers. The way we have to kill the fathers in order to become ourselves, this sort of influence. And sometimes those young people grow up and they change. So let's look at the way TS Eliot does this and see what we think of it. And of course, there are many different ways that different kind of takes that you can have. What was modernism in the arts? Modernism was a rebellion against a kind of late romantic bourgeois culture. Romanticism had started optimistically in the 19th century. Smell those daffodils, right? That's the cool thing about this mic, I can wander around. Is that okay if I wander around? Smell those daffodils. Nature is what we want. It's this freedom. It's this organic world, not this artificial world. Man is liberated when he is close to nature. But Romanticism went sour too. Romanticism, which started with this idea of men, free in nature, began to see nature increasingly as hostile. And so by late Romanticism, in the late 19th century, you have man against an indifferent nature. Nature turns out to be not so much daffodils as shipwrecks and volcanoes or earthquakes and things that kill you. And so you had either a depressive Romanticism at the end, or you had what I would call Romanticism in denial at the end of the 19th century. Romanticism in denial at the end of the 18th century was Romanticism that, these paintings that you see in the museum of like nymphs and satyrs and gods playing by splashing pools. You get a kind of very sort of decadent, smarmy, classical gods, Greek myths kind of, painting that's very soft focus, kind of sentimental in its way. And so you have these dark Wagnerian romantics who see the world in apocalyptic terms, and you have these people who are saying, look at the beauty of the female form, lots of nude nymphs, of course, frolicking by those fountains, and you have this kind of split personality in late Romanticism. We're talking late 1900s, early 20s, first few years of the 20th century. And then all hell breaks loose. And that world suddenly seems completely inadequate. For one thing, World War I happens in 1914. In which case you have Europe in flames, blood spilt everywhere, a kind of civil war in Europe. And you have, of course, not only war, but you have technological war. You have war where the technology was making it so that killing on a mass scale was possible. And not only that, what was really disturbing about this was not just the amount of bloodshed, but the way that these technological engines of destruction took away anything that was recognizably human. Like the famous thing about the landscapes of World War I, this trench warfare, was that it destroyed all the trees, it tore up all the grass. It was one big muddy battlefield with stumps and debris everywhere. In other words, the world was changed from what it looked like normally with grass and trees to literally a kind of abstraction. The technology had taken the normal world and abstracted it to this kind of gray canvas, this muddy canvas. And of course, this was deeply traumatic to this time period. And those nymphs sporting around, or those self-involved Wagnerians who were like, oh, nature is against us, but they looked navel-gazing and narcissistic and self-involved to this group of young people in the early 1900s who said, this is all flatulent, self-indulgent denial of what is true about the world. We live in a world of terror. We live in a world of the machine. We live in a world where if we want to get real, we have to talk about not nymphs and satyrs, but people going to work in subways and living in little single furnished rooms in the city. We need, once again, revolution as a way of trying to get real, revolution as a way of trying to speak honestly about the way things are. If this is a machine age, if this is a world of factories and automobiles and subway trains, then we need to write about that. And we need to celebrate it in a way. We need to not pretend that being a nymph and a satyr in a pastoral world of fountains and gardens is good enough. It's not good enough. It's not the world in which we live. And so modernism celebrates this world of technology, this world of the urban concentration, the way that people were all coming to the cities to find work, and doing so in ways that disrupted all of the traditions of the way that human beings had related to the world. So, what are some of the hallmark works of modernism? Things that you may have at least come across in some class or some art history book that you glanced, some museum you walked through. Here are some of the classic works of modernism. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I don't know if you've ever seen this picture, but it's a famous painting. It's iconic of modernism. It shows 4 nude women in various poses standing in front of you. You may recall that it's, of course, one of the first paintings where, like 2 eyeballs are on one side and a nose is sticking out here. That kind of weirdness that Picasso did, right? But more important is not just the rearranging of facial features on the head, but the fact that a couple of these figures have African masks on instead of human faces. And these are not little nymphs disporting around the fountain. These demoiselles, these young women, are prostitutes. They're prostitutes. This is reality. These women are not innocent nymphs. This is the world of desire and human grubbiness and darkness that is the truth about the world that those nymphs are in denial about. So Picasso puts them literally in our face. And by giving a couple of them African masks, he gives them a kind of sacred power. He gives them a kind of dark energy, because they become almost like sort of goddesses of the flesh, of lust, of frankness about their bodies. And this is one of the characteristics of modernism, that it rejects the kind of bourgeois Christianity of its era, which these people also felt was a kind of religion in denial, a religion that was merely a prop to the power structures of the day, that was merely a social thing, that there was not really a thing of deep faith or philosophical vision. And they turned increasingly toward ancient myths and primitivism. There's a Gauguin exhibition right now at SAM, right? There's a guy who was this same era, a little earlier than the group I'm talking about, but he's what they call Postimpressionist, so it's only a couple decades before what I'm talking about with modernism. Gauguin leaves what he thinks to be this blasé France of his time to go to Tahiti to meet these simple people in touch with nature, in touch with their bodies, etc. Now, of course, that's a whole new can of worms there that I can't go into, because is he discovering freedom, or is he objectifying women in a colonial, imperialistic kind of mentality? Well, I can't go there today. But you see the environment which I'm talking about, that modernism comes out of. So, like Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. In music, The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, staged in Paris with modern art as the background. Before it was even finished, people were leaving their seats and storming out of the theater and throwing stuff at the orchestra and the stage. Because what is the rite of spring but an ancient fertility rite that becomes the source of this music? And it has this driving beat, this kind of driving rhythm to it, which is, again, the kind of tom-tom of the primitive man who's in touch with these realities of who we are as beings. In literature, you have things like James Joyce's Ulysses, which chronicles a single day in somebody's life, not like those 19th century novels that took you, like David Copperfield, that took you through an entire person's life and sought to give you a structure, a known structure of reality. But someone in the modern era, a modernist writer, writes about one day in the life, just a slice, just a tiny slice of a human being's life, and tries to see in that very mundane day, going around Dublin, doing his thing, popping into the pub, talking to his wife, going to the store, that there is meaning again in this mundane real world around us. And then you get T.S. Eliot with poems like The Love Song of Dre Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland, showing a world that is so fragmented that the lines of poetry are full of fragments, sentences that don't even end, little tiny snippets either of overheard language, say at the pub, or perhaps snippets from the literary classics that are really half forgotten because the modern era doesn't care anymore about the classics of the Western literary tradition, and we've forgotten what they are. And so we get, with these modernist artists, a number of key features. Let me just review what some of those are. They're interested in the urbanization, in the way that modern industrial society brings people into huge conglomerations. Urbanization leads to mass culture. Mass culture, which is something that people didn't have the means of communication to have. We live in a mass culture now that we take for granted, where memes, where every latest trend is instantly available on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere we go. But in an era before this kind of concentration, people lived in isolated pockets. Information didn't flow. You didn't have brands back then. There were no brands, there were no trends, there were no fads. But beginning in the early 20th century, you find a series of trends that Eliot's fascinated with, where people become subject to mass advertising and sort of the early means of modernity, things that people are trying to sell you, and it becomes a consumerist culture. And the modernists are frankly fascinated by this. The way that modernity affects people is that it changes the way that they relate to the world. It changes the way that they actually take in information. So for example, prior to this Industrial Revolution, how did people move? They moved around by foot, they moved by horse, and they moved by those slow-moving, chugging trains that would puff their way through the countryside. Even with a train, which is a piece of modern industrial, still had a link to the countryside. You looked out the window, you could see the passing countryside. Eliot becomes fascinated with the subway, the underground in London, because for the first time, you start in one place, you go into darkness, and you end up in a different place. There's no organic relationship. There's no transition. It's one thing, and it's suddenly another thing. You see what I'm saying? He was actually curious about the way that changed our perception of things. Then how about the telephone? The telephone, again, something we take for granted. In the early days, do you know how people answered the telephone? They didn't say hello. In the earliest days of the telephone, people would pick it up and say, "Are you there? Are you there?" Because there was this sense of the disembodied voice, not personal presence, not me talking to you, not me relating to you, seeing your body language, smelling your pheromones, knowing your history, but a voice coming out of nowhere, a voice abstracted from its context. Eliot was fascinated by that. And his famous poem, The Wasteland, is known as a poem of voices. A poem where there is no single voice, it's 24 different voices. Telephone itself changes the way that we perceive information. The critic Hugh Kinner says, "The Wasteland is, so to speak, a telephone poem. Its multiple voices referable to a massive short circuit at the central exchange." urbanization, mass culture, fragmentation. I've already talked about the way that warfare and technology fragment our experience and cause it to be chopped up and non-continuous. I talked about primitivism, the search for something beyond a bourgeois authoritarian culture. And I've talked about the mundane, the everyday. All of these things are evident in Eliot's poetry. Eliot's famous beginning of J. Alfred Prufrock starts out, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table." That's his famous modernist metaphor, that the evening sky is like a patient in a hospital under anesthetic. It's dark, it's disturbing, it makes you think, it alludes to technology, modern medicine, and it very much takes down the notion that high art is about elevated things, and it puts us flatly in human experience at its most raw and vulnerable. With the other masquerades that time resumes, one thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. Eliot, again, is fascinated by the way that urbanization takes people and makes them cogs in an immense wheel, leaves them in little apartments so that they've lost connection to history, to family, and they become alienated and alone. Eliot said that the internal combustion engine changed the rhythm of modernity, and that's why you get Stravinsky and others using this driving, pulsing rhythm. The piston engine becomes the new rhythm of modernism. And that's why modernism sought the energy of the machine. That's why all those great modern architects celebrated not the natural curves of the landscape of the earth, of the natural world, but the sharp right angles of the constructed world, the sharp right angles of made things. Jeffrey's poster for today's talk, with its horizontal, and it's not an allusion to tic-tac-toe, it's an allusion to the famous modernist artist Piet Mondrian, whose paintings started off realistically and after World War I became abstracted into these right angles and these color planes of primary colors, yellow, blue, and green. Oh, yellow, blue, and green, yeah. Well, red. Yellow, blue, red. Thank you. Exactly right. Why? Because this is to get at the essence of reality. This is to get at the deep structures of reality. And that shined well with the intellectual ideas of that age. They wanted to get down to the bedrock. Freud helped people to get down to the bedrock of the human psychology, of the psyche. Marx helped people to get down to the bedrock of how does actual labor and production work? How do these power structures get made? Darwin helps us to get down to the bedrock of nature itself, of the biosphere, of evolution. And these modern thinkers were embraced. And their ways of accounting for the world were embraced by the modernists. The way critics have put this is that the modernists embraced what are called master narratives. Master narratives. These big overarching schemes that account for so much of reality. Because they had defeated the old master narrative of the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman system that had been part of Western civ before then. Because that tradition of Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas and all of that tradition had brought about this world of oppression, this world of the bourgeois consumer culture. So modernism embraced secular master narratives as a way of defeating this discredited, older theological, philosophical master narrative. And it was trying to get down to the bone, down to the essence of things. And Eliot embraces this himself. Think about The Wasteland. If you look at that poem, you see that it's got all of these elements in it. It's fascinated by the way that people cannot connect to one another in this modern era. They're prey to these Freudian urges, but they cannot connect. And you get these different scenes of sort of fumbling, failed sexual encounters in this poem. And ironically, these like dates from hell get narrated by an ancient figure from classical myth, Tiresias. You may recall that Tiresias was a character who believed that he could tell the gods who had the more profound sexual experience, man or women, who had more pleasure, who had a richer sexual experience. But when he answered that women did, he was cursed by Zeus, who didn't like that at all, and given the sexual characteristics of both men and women. So he was a hermaphrodite. So Tiresias is this figure of the man-woman. He becomes a prophet. He becomes a seer. He can see all of experience. Eliot has Tiresias, this blind prophet, and nobody listens to prophets, tell us these stories of these sad, failed connections. Now, it sounds depressing, right? It sounds, unhappy. But to that era, it was the breath of fresh air. To that era, it was writing that did not go into denial. It was writing that told it like it is. Life is hard. People don't connect. We're all cogs in this large industrial machine. We're separated from another. Our experience is fragmented. We start here, we go into a dark tube, we come out there. We hear disembodied voices. This is who we are. We don't connect. E.M. Forster, the famous novelist, made his motto, just a few years after this, only connect. Only connect was his motto, because he was responding to this alienation. In The Wasteland, Eliot writes of his own experience of mental exhaustion. He goes to a seaside town because he's had a nervous breakdown, and he says, on Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. And it continues, and this is typical of the way the poem works. The fingernails of dirty hands, my people, humble people who expect nothing. La la, to Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest, burning. So what do we have? We've got the fragmentation going on here. We've got these allusions to different sources all jumbled together. This doesn't make sense. These aren't even whole sentences. The poetry itself is fragmented the way human experience is. But at that very point where it may seem like all is lost and there's no hope and this doesn't mean anything and it's just random, there is the possibility of something profound and regenerative and meaningful going on. Because if you study these poems carefully, what you see is that Eliot increasingly looks at a fragment and says, this is the world we live in. It is fragmented. But the fragment points toward a wholeness. A fragment is always making us wonder what completes it, what makes it whole. And this is the essence of modernism at its best. Because modernism at its best says, I, the artist, am not going to do all the work for you. I'm not going to just tell you what I think. I'm not just going to lay it out. Art is interactive. Art is this process by which you, the reader, complete the meaning of the work. I come part way, but you have to come part way toward me. No longer is the notion that the artwork is something you just sit there like in front of a TV screen and take in. That's part of that whole bourgeois era. Modernism says, no, I'm not just not opening your brain pan and ladling in a little something. Art is about your interpretation of what I'm putting out there. And here at this moment of seeming, lostness, of brokenness and fragmentedness, Eliot finds hope. Eliot finds hope because he thinks these fragments point towards what we long for. You can blow people up on the battlefield. You can shove them in subways, put them in cogs in a wheel, put them in dingy apartments, but they still have hearts. They still have a human yearning for meaning and for connection. And so Eliot's fragments, when read properly, point towards completion. And what we do as readers then, and sometimes we resent this because it's like, wait, you want me to do some of the work? Like I have to look at a footnote? I have to think about, everything that I've ever seen in museums and read in historical context? Yeah. This is, art is for grown-ups. Art is for people who, are not just sitting there saying, impress me. Art is for people who want to do some work. So think about this fragment I just read. On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. The fingernails of dirty hands, my people, humble people who expect nothing. La la. To Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest burning. What's going on here? Well, you can figure out what some of these allusions are. Some of them, for the readers of the time, would not have been difficult to pick up. So, again, I know we live in a different culture, so this is not about then is better, now is worse, although in some ways I tend to be a little crusty that way myself. But for example, to Carthage then I came. Carthage being the ancient city in North Africa that was, fought wars with Rome, but it was also famously the place where St. Augustine described in his famous book, The Confessions, that along his own journey, his own path through alienation and through confusion and through struggles with lust and who he was as a human being, he came to Carthage, which was for him the big city. So Carthage keeps the city metaphor, which is at the heart of the wasteland. And he says, and of course, if you know the rest of the line, to Carthage I came, that city of boiling with unholy lusts. It was the big city. It was a world of Picasso's prostitutes. It was the world of the sort of dark desires of the human heart. It was a place where on his journey he got lost. In Carthage, Augustine got lost. He lost sight of who he was as a human being. He lost sight of meaning. Why throw this into the wasteland? Why to Carthage then I came? Because it fits. It fits with what Eliot's doing. It's precisely an allusion to one of the great thinkers of our tradition, who ended up telling a story about how he went on from Carthage to discover God. and his way as a human being. You may not agree with it, it may not be your personal faith, but Augustine's story is a story of self-discovery, of meaning, and a rejection of mere bestiality, animality, and it is part of our literature, part of our cultural heritage. With that clue of "To Carthage Then I Came," Augustine's story, it's not that hard to think that, "O Lord, thou pluckst me out." Where does that come from? That's also from the Confessions. That's just an old world translation in the Victorian thous and these kind of translation. "O Lord, thou pluckst me out." God, you pulled me out. You plucked me out of this lostness. Then we get burning. Burning, 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 burning. It's repeated again and again. What is burning? Burning is burning with lust. But burning can also be other kinds of burning. And writers love nothing than to see multiple meanings occurring in any kind of word, right? So burning can be burning with lust, but it also can be refining fire. It also can be the burning of illumination, the burning of purgation, purging those lusts and trying to achieve something higher. This section is in Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. It's called the Fire Sermon, which is an allusion to a famous talk given by the Buddha. So what Eliot is doing is he's mingling Christian and Buddhist terms together as a way of trying to seek meaning in this meaningless world. He also later includes Hindu concepts at the end of the poem. And this is where it interestingly happens that Eliot is already beginning to maybe turn on modernism in some way. He's already beginning to question whether those modern master narratives, those stories of Freud, Marx, and Darwin, are sufficient. They tell us that there are certain truths about who we are, but do they tell us enough? Do they tell us enough, and do they tell us enough so that we can find out the fullness of our nature? So Eliot begins to doubt the power of these modern master narratives. And he asks himself, what if religion is actually a source of truth? At this point, he hasn't made any decisions yet. He hasn't got down on his knees to pray. But he says, what if we've been eliminating a source of truth? And something interesting happens at this point with Eliot. He says, what if religion at its heart is not about oppression and power structures? What if religion is about a search for meaning? And what if the religious concept of mystery helps us to actually break away from these power structures and find meaning in our experience? And so Eliot begins to do something that counters what his other fellow modernists are interested in. Interestingly enough, he was not alone in this. Igor Stravinsky, who I told you about, who wrote this famous Rite of Spring with its pagan fertility ritual, returns to the Russian Orthodox tradition, and composes works that are very modern, but within a Christian framework. And so you begin to have a questioning of the questioners. The guy who is a modernist embracing the modern master narratives questions whether the modern master narratives are sufficient to tell us the truth. The Fire Sermon is a turning point. And this is where we come to postmodernism. Because postmodernism is about the questioning of the master narratives. Postmodernism says these are always inherently oppressive structures. They try to do too much. They're a product of human pride. So to quote some of the fancy French thinkers, they're always the fanciest for some reason, those Frenchies. As opposed to the grand récit, the grand master narratives, all we can really do is tell the petite histoire, the little stories, the personal stories, the intimate level. Anytime we try to get cosmic, we oppress and we fail. Let's tell the intimate truth of private experience. So postmodernism becomes a revolution against modernism. All that confidence, all that notion that you could build modernist art on Freud, Marx, Darwin. Think about Ulysses is based on Homer, right? James Joyce takes Homer to be the basis, this great classical myth. All that ambition, all that confidence of modernism is questioned by postmodernism. We need to tell the intimate, private story. And suddenly, with Eliot, you see that it's exactly the same. This man who at one point had said, I'm a classicist. I'm going to tell the world of modernity like it is. And Eliot famously said, emotion is the worst thing about art. Subjective is dangerous. We need to be objective. So he throws in all these other voices in the wasteland, precisely so that his voice isn't heard. He tries to escape and let this big structure exist on its own. And then comes this turning point at the end of the wasteland, and then you look at Eliot's later poems. And again, this is a major writer. This is cool stuff. I do hope one day, if you haven't tackled it, that you do read Eliot. His poems come next, Ash Wednesday and Four Quartets. And what happens? In those poems, he no longer is disappeared. He's no longer absent. He tells stories that involve himself. He takes the more intimate, subjective role. And he says, my story matters. My story matters. That's what Augustine's Confessions were about, right? Augustine's Confessions are the first autobiographies, serious, real autobiography in the modern sense. They were the notion that faith in God enabled Augustine to believe that my individual story matters. So Eliot begins to tell his own story and to begin to speak in his own voice. So Ash Wednesday, which is a poem about penitence, about giving up power and control, starts like this. And you'll hear familiar elements. Because I do not hope to turn again. Because I do not hope. Because I do not hope to turn. Desiring this man's gift and that man's scope. I no longer strive to stride towards such things. Why should the aged eagle stretch its wings? Why should I mourn the vanished power of the usual rain? And rain not in drops falling, but power of the regime, the political structure. Hear how it's repeating fragmented sentences again, because I do not hope to turn, because I do not hope. But now, these fragments point more clearly to wholeness. For example, later in this poem, Eliot quotes this fragment, and it just sits there on a line by itself. And after this, our exile. Nothing else. Well, what the casual reader doesn't know is that comes from a famous prayer called the Salve Regina, a hymn to the Blessed Virgin Mary in Christian tradition. And the way the line is completed is, and after this our exile, show us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. So what Eliot's now doing is he's pointing with his newfound religious faith to the way that he believes the fragment needs to be completed. we've forgotten this faith. And we only remember it in, you get even comedies today, people are trying to, you get comic characters who are in the midst of some apocalypse and they're trying to remember how to even pray like the Our Father, and they can't even get it right. Because we've forgotten these traditions that were so deeply ingrained in our history. So Eliot becomes personal and intimate in his poetry. He writes in the 4 quartets, these 4 poems, each of which is based on something connected to him personally, his family's history. People have said that if you look at the Wasteland, the Ash Wednesday, and the 4 quartets, you see a sequence that is just like Dante's Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso, or Heaven. That Eliot's career is sort of mapped over that movement in Dante, from the darkness of alienation, through purgation, through this turning toward a possibility of grace and fulfillment. And what Eliot's theme is in 4 quartets is how difficult it is to write master narratives, to write as if you can take everything into account. So for example, he writes about the insufficiency of language to be all comprehensive. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. Shrieking voices, scolding, mocking, or merely chattering always assail them. So language itself, poetry itself, can no longer achieve this comprehensive master narrative. So postmodernism, which is questioning our ability to know and comprehend and moves us towards the intimate and the personal, is precisely the way that Eliot's poetry goes. And it points to our world. Even though he wrote these poems in the mid-1940s, these last poems, 4 quartets, point toward the undoing of modernism and the arrival of postmodernism. Does that mean that Eliot was a traitor? Does it mean that he abandoned what he believed most holy? Or does it mean that he pursued a line of reasoning that was always inherent in the studies and the vision of modernism that he undertook? That's a good question. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and I'll just say that I know that it's difficult to listen to a lecture about a writer who many of you haven't read, so it's not like you have a lot of references. But if you care about modern poetry, if you care about the history of kind of modern intellectual debates of the last 100 years, T.S. Eliot is a major figure. You may not agree with him, but he's somebody who deserves respect and deserves engagement. So on this nice, warm spring morning, thank you for letting me expound, and I'll call it to a close there.
Does anyone have any questions? There's some time for questions if you'd like to ask some. Just
Nope.
raise your hand and I'll pass the microphone to you.
No questions too obvious, too simple, to anything. Just if you're curious about anything or you want to comment, go for it.
How did the rise of National Socialism in Germany affect his poetry? Let's talk about the 30s.
Well, this is definitely one of the big crises of modernism. Is modernist writers were susceptible to the rise of modern ideologies because they believed that they were these comprehensive world systems that could potentially remake the world. And so you find people like Yeats being an early admirer of Mussolini. And you find someone like Ezra Pound foolishly, stupidly making radio broadcast during the war, because from Italy, where he was living at the time and where he got stuck during the war, that were pro-fascist. Eliot has been accused with some reason of anti-Semitism, because like many people of that era, you can catch him red-handed, making very prejudicial remarks. It's sort of like when we watch Mad Men and we see, people saying things that make us wince today about the way men treat women, for example. Eliot does that, in relation to Jews in a way that's terrible. But the one thing I'll say about Eliot is that he never got tempted by these totalitarian systems. He may have had some very knee-jerk and narrow ideas about Jews, although he had many friends who were Jewish too. He understood it as, at that point, a kind of pride. His faith, at least whether you agree with it or not, at least had him say, this is politics trying to become God, and therefore, from my point of view, I have to dissent from it. And so a lot of what Four Quartets is about is trying to find meaning in the middle of war. Because he writes these poems during the Blitz. There's scenes set in the Blitz. And again, you get something, in the Four Quartets, you get a lot of the wasteland kind of world. It's still there. Again, that's what I was didn't have time to really get into. But, his work changes, but it also stays the same. It's just that there's a different spin, so that you get some darkness of wartime in Four Quartets, but you also get the possibility that grace is available, that there's hope even in the midst of the despair of war. So he was not taken in by that. In fact, he was running a magazine, and he was so depressed by Chamberlain's caving in and all of that he just abandoned the magazine. That was part of his life at that point, and I just came across that fact today. So he rejected it, but modernism was susceptible because it had all these ambitions that were almost godlike. And of course, godlike ambitions can sometimes make godlike works. I mean, Joyce's Ulysses is a great novel, right? I mean, it's powerful, and I don't mean to say that it's ungodly, but there was a lot of ambition of a certain kind in that era, and it became susceptible to political systems that were ambitious too. Okay. Man, at the back.
Okay. At the risk of seeming trite, I teach proofrock, especially in my 20th century American learning community.
Yes.
And where my students know Eliot is from cats.
Yes.
And you said a couple things about fragmentation and about valuing the personal story that made me see maybe a way I can help make links for my students. But I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, yes. For those of you who don't know, Eliot was fond of cats, and he wrote a series of poems called Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which then became a Broadway musical called Cats, with which I'm not deeply familiar. I wish I could build much of a bridge there. I've never been a huge fan of those poems. To me, they were poems that he wrote to kind of blow off steam and to be a kind of respite from his more intense, prophetic, theological wrestlings that he went through. But I would be curious to find somebody who could connect the dots between those two. I, unfortunately, cannot be the guy.
Okay.
Sorry. Man.
So would you say that he came full circle from the decline of Romanticism and that belief in that God from modernism? Did he come full circle, or did he move beyond it?
It's difficult. I don't want to make a sweeping statement that's too ambitious. But in one sense, he does embrace the subjective and the intimate. And there's a lot of, while there's still, like, as I said, the city is still important in Four Quartets under the Blitz. It's important. You get gardens and the ocean, and nature starts to come back in his poems. And so, in one sense, he does embrace a kind of romantic subjectivity. And his argument is that faith undergirds this, because faith is the way that that our intimate story gets grafted into this larger theological, biblical story. But in some ways, you could say that he had come 180 degrees. In other ways, you could say he's trying to synthesize, take thesis and antithesis, and make synthesis, that there are elements of everything in his career, that he comes up to a new wholeness. That's an ongoing debate. I think you could really argue that either way. But it's true that many revolutionaries come to embrace the thing that they fought against, and often have this, and this is sometimes, to do with aging too, like, you're young and you're absolute and it's the cause and it's, and then you're old and you realize everything's ambiguous and you can see both sides of every argument, and you start trying to bring these things together. So, I started off as an either-or kind of guy, and now I'm like more of a both-and kind of guy, where I tend to see, and I think Eliot went through that journey, but in a way, he did have to eat crow about some of those earlier statements. He clearly was not a classicist in any real sense. He was ultimately a kind of Christian romantic in some sense at the end. So that's a great question. Sir, the back.
I can understand what you're saying when you talk about Eliot and modernism, but I don't really follow you when you talk about Eliot as a postmodernist. I mean, I can't connect him to any kind of postmodern philosopher. I mean, I'm thinking about somebody like Derrida, who talks about the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. I just don't see as somebody who embraces kind of religious point of view as a postmodernist. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I can only do a kind of quick sketch. But I mean, the argument is, postmodernism says the Grand Récit, the master narratives, are oppressive and false. The petite histoire, the intimate stories, are the only place where we can find scraps of truth. When Eliot writes the four quartets, he's not trying to write this comprehensive poem about modern London. He writes Burnt Norton, East Coker, Dry Salvages. All three of those places have ties to his own personal family history, the roots that he's come from in Missouri, in Harvard, in New England, and he takes a very different approach where he goes for this intimate voice and the subjectivity of his life, rather than the wasteland, which is this externalized structure of voices in which the poet is sort of off, pulling, speaking through these microphones, or these megaphones, but not actually being present in the work. Eliot becomes very interested in the contingency of knowledge, how difficult it is to know and to grasp reality, and he questions those big structures' ability to know, and he ends up deciding that, in his opinion, Christianity at its best is not about big structures trying to impose, but about a search, about a journey toward mystery, toward a kind of unknown, in which absence and presence become the dialectic of the journey. And those are terms that I know Derrida uses. He uses the whole sense of kind of how difficult it is to capture presence, how elusive it is. And Eliot ends up saying, you know what, this ancient religious search at its best becomes a way of pursuing this difficult, arduous task of finding presence and holding on to presence. So I think there are connections, but I'm not enough of an expert to quote chapter and verse from Derrida or Foucault or whoever. Anything else on this beautiful day when you're inside and listening to some guy ranting onward?
Could you talk more about him being a monarchist and how that lines up with any of postmodern sort of views?
Well, Eliot is, at this point, he's really ornery. He's caught up. This is what I call like Culture Wars 1. You know, this is culture wars of early 20th century. And certainly when he becomes Christian, he does feel himself to be ostracized, and he does feel himself to be in a real antagonistic position to a lot of the current intellectual life at the time. So he sort of says, monarchy is about tradition, it's about an organic, it's about a givenness to the political world that transcends our ability to make something. The queen exists, there's the fact that the queen exists means that we can't just chop her head off and remake society in our own way. In some ways, there's kind of a historical rootedness to the monarchy that precisely stands athwart any scheme to just impose an external ideological structure on the world. It's evolved, it's not imposed. And it's evolved in a way that may seem trite or absurd. The queen, what does the queen do? She cuts ribbons at nursery schools and gives an annual New Year's talk, you know, in stilted accents. But for Eliot, monarchy is a way of saying, you know, the modern notion that we can remake the world is wrong, and you need to work with tradition and engage in a dialectic with tradition and not try to create something out of whole cloth. And so, in that sense, it's a rejection of abstract ideologies of the 20th century. But it is. I mean, he knew it was slightly absurd to put it that way. He knew it would be like fighting words, and people would go, "What? Huh?" And he had the ability. He was not a combative type in the sense of conflict lover and confrontational, but he was more like the arched eyebrow. He was always like slipping in a little irony that people would like do a double take. Like, is he pulling my leg? What is it? He doesn't mean that, and because he always loved to make people think. So that's partly what he was doing there, was just kind of yanking our chain, as they say. So yeah.
He's an American living in London.
He's an American who becomes an expatriate in England from the mid-1920s and lives there the rest of his life, you know, with just occasional trips back to give lectures or visit family in the US of A. Kind of like Henry James, you know. It was a thing back then, you know. I mean, Hemingway, those people went to Europe at that time. You know, America seemed too pragmatic, too much of a consumer society, not enough space of grace and beauty that the artist needs to believe that they could do their work. Doesn't happen as much these days, although you find interestingly British people like Christopher Hitchens coming to the United States and living here. So I suppose you could write an interesting book contrasting